The ice did not crack. It screamed. Deep in the frozen valley of Corin, in the winter of 1342, Dahlia Ashford knelt at the edge of a broken lake with a rope wound twice around her wrist. 11 wolves lay behind her on the snow, soaked and shivering, pulled one by one from a current that should have killed them. She did not know why she was doing this. She only knew the ice had opened like a mouth, and something underneath had been screaming. Her village called her strange for it. A trapper's daughter who could not walk past a drowning animal without stopping. Her father used to say her heart would be the death of her, and her father had been a careful man, the kind who lived long because he never reached into water he could not see the bottom of. Dahlia had inherited his hands and none of his caution. The 12th wolf surfaced last. It was larger than any animal she had seen alive, its fur black as char, its eyes the deep gold of a struck match. When her rope caught around its neck, the ice beneath her feet did not crack from her weight. It cracked from his. She dragged him onto the snow, and for one long breath, he did not move. Then his eyes opened, and they were not the eyes of a wolf at all. "You shouldn't have done that," he said, in a voice that came from a human throat though no human throat had been visible a moment before. The black fur was already receding into skin, into a man kneeling in the snow in front of her, broad-shouldered, scarred along one cheekbone, breathing like the act of breathing was new to him again. Dahlia did not scream. She had grown up around men who hunted things larger than themselves, and screaming had never once saved anyone's life. "Who are you?" she said instead, and the man looked at her the way a person looks at a fire they were not expecting to need. "Captain Roan Calloway," he said. "Of the King's Own. Or I was, before they put me under that ice to die." The warning. Word travels faster than wind in a valley this small, and by the second morning, half of Corin knew that the trapper's daughter had pulled 12 wolves from Lake Mire and one of them had stood up like a man. The village elder, a sharp-eyed woman named Ottilie Marsh, came to Dahlia's cabin before the sun had fully cleared the ridge. "You know what he is," Ottilie said. It was not a question. "He says he's a soldier," Dahlia answered. "He's a bound one. Cursed to wear a wolf's skin by the men who feared what he'd become as a man." Ottilie's voice dropped low. "They drowned 11 of his pack to break him, and when that didn't work, they drowned him too. You didn't save a soldier, girl. You interrupted an execution." Dahlia looked back toward the barn, where Roan was sitting wrapped in her father's old coat, talking quietly to the other 11, who had not yet shifted back and showed no sign that they intended to. She felt something cold settle in her stomach that had nothing to do with the weather. "Whose execution?" she asked. "Who wanted him dead?" Ottilie did not answer right away, and that silence told Dahlia more than words would have. "His own brother," the elder finally said. "Garrick Calloway. He sits on the throne now because the old king believed Roan died at the border 2 winters ago. If Garrick learns his brother is walking around with a heartbeat, he won't send soldiers next time. What will he send? Something that doesn't need to breathe to kill you." What the wolf remembered. That night, Roan told her the rest of it by the fire, and Dahlia listened the way she used to listen to her father's hunting stories, except this one did not end with anyone coming home safe. He had been the better soldier. Everyone had always said so, the men in the barracks, the old king himself, and Garrick had heard it said one time too many. So Garrick had gone to a witch on the eastern road and paid her in gold to put a wolf's skin over his brother's bones, thinking a beast in the woods would never threaten a man on a throne. "But you didn't run," Dahlia said. "I tried to come home," Roan said. "The pack found me first. 11 wolves who'd lost their own packs to hunters, men just like the men who hunt wolves around here. We weren't friends. We were just all of us alone in the same forest, so we stopped being alone together." His jaw tightened. "Garrick found out I was still close. Still myself, in the parts that mattered. So he had us driven onto the lake ice in the dead of winter and broke it under us with cannon fire." "That's not protecting a throne," Dahlia said quietly. That's just cruelty wearing a crown. Rowan looked at her like the sentence had cost him something to hear out loud, something he hadn't let himself admit on his own. Most people who learn what I am want me gone before sundown, he said. You're sitting closer to the fire instead of further from it. I pulled 12 wolves out of a frozen lake yesterday, Dahlia said. I think I gave up on being a sensible woman somewhere around wolf number 4. For the first time since she dragged him out of the water, he laughed, and it cracked something open in his face that looked like it hadn't been used in a long while. What the wolf remembered. The fire had burned down to a low orange bed of coals by the time Rowan finally spoke, and Dahlia had the sense that he had been choosing his words the way a man chooses his footing on ice he doesn't trust. She didn't push him. She had learned that from years of sitting beside wounded animals her father brought home, the ones too frightened to be touched until they decided on their own that the hand reaching toward them wasn't another trap. You don't have to tell me anything tonight, she said, mostly to give him a way out if he wanted one. I know. He stared into the coals like they held the rest of the story written somewhere in the orange light. But you pulled a rope tight enough to leave a mark on your own hands for a stranger you didn't owe anything to. I think that earns you the truth, even the parts of it that don't make me look like much of a man. She didn't argue with that. She simply waited, the way she used to wait for her father's stories to find their shape, and after a moment, Rowan began. I was the better soldier, he said. I want you to understand I'm not saying that with any pride left in it. It's just a fact, the kind men stayed about weather or harvests. I could read a battlefield the way you read a storm coming over the ridge. I trained faster, I commanded easier, men followed me without needing to be told twice. The old king said it to my face more than once, in front of rooms full of people who would carry the word straight back to my brother before I'd even left the hall. And Garrick heard it, Dahlia said. Garrick heard it from everyone. From soldiers, from servants, from visiting lords who meant nothing cruel by it and had no idea what they were loading onto his back every time they said it. Rowan's voice didn't rise, but something in it tightened, like a rope drawn taut. I used to think he'd grow past it. We were brothers. I thought brothers found their way back to each other even after envy got its hands on them for a while. I was wrong about that, and I was slow to admit I was wrong, which cost more than it should have. Dahlia pulled her knees up toward her chest, wrapping her arms around them, and watched him in the firelight. There was a stillness to the way he told it, the stillness of someone who had rehearsed the story alone in the dark long before he ever had anyone to tell it to. How does a man go from being jealous of his brother to doing what he did to you? She asked. That's a long road. I want to understand the whole of it, not just the ending. Rowan exhaled slowly, and for a moment he looked less like a soldier and more like a younger brother trying to make sense of an older grief that had never properly healed. There was a witch on the eastern road, he said. Most people in the capital pretended she didn't exist, the way people pretend a lot of inconvenient things don't exist if ignoring them is easier than dealing with them. Garrick wasn't interested in pretending. He went to her with a bag of gold and a problem he wanted solved quietly, and she gave him exactly the kind of solution a desperate man asks for when he isn't thinking past tomorrow. A curse, Dahlia said. A skin, Rowan corrected gently. That's how she put it to him, or so I was told much later by someone who regretted helping arrange the meeting. Not a death. A skin. Put a wolf's hide over his brother's bones, and the brother who outshines you at court disappears into the forest where he can't outshine anyone anymore. No funeral to explain. No body for anyone to mourn over and ask uncomfortable questions about. Just a man who goes missing on patrol and a wolf no one would ever think to connect to him. Dahlia felt something cold settle low in her stomach, colder than the night air around them. He thought a beast in the woods could never threaten a man on a throne, she said slowly, working it through out loud. He didn't kill you because killing you felt too much like murder. He just made you disappear instead, and told himself that was different. That's exactly what he told himself, Rowan said. I know because I've had a great deal of time alone in the cold to imagine the conversation he must have had with himself to make it sound bearable. The fire popped, sending up a small shower of sparks, and Dahlia watched them die out before she spoke again. "But you didn't run," she said. "Most men, waking up in a wolf's skin in the middle of a forest, would have run as far from people as their legs could carry them. You said you tried to come home instead." "I did try," he said, and something in his voice softened, like the memory still had some warmth left in it despite everything that came after. "It took time to understand what had happened to me, longer still to learn how to move through the world without giving myself away every time hunger or fear got the better of me and pulled the wolf forward. But once I understood it, my first thought wasn't escape. It was Garrick. It was the old king. It was the idea that if I could just get close enough to explain myself, somebody would believe me and put things right again. What happened instead? The pack found me first," he said, and for the first time, real feeling crept into his voice, something gentler than the careful recitation he'd been using until then. 11 wolves who'd already lost everything to men with traps and arrows, men not so different from the ones in this very valley, if I'm honest with you. They didn't trust me at first. A wolf that smells like a man underneath the fur is not a comfortable thing to be near, not for an animal that's learned the hard way what men do to wolves. But they let you stay. We weren't friends, not at first," he said. "We were just all of us alone in the same forest, and there's only so long a creature can stand being alone before staying alone starts to feel like its own kind of death. So we stopped being alone together instead. It wasn't friendship in the beginning. It was just two different kinds of grief deciding to share the same fire, more or less." Dahlia thought of the 11 wolves resting in her barn that very moment, and the way they had looked at Roan in the snow when she'd first seen him, not like prey or stranger, but like something closer to kin. It made more sense to her now, hearing it laid out plainly. "How did Garrick find out you'd survived?" she asked. Roan's jaw tightened, and for the first time, Dahlia saw the soldier underneath the storyteller's surface, the part of him that had clearly relived this next portion of the tale more times than he would ever admit out loud. A scout, eventually. Then a rumor. Then Garrick himself, I believe, though I never saw him with my own eyes until the day we left for the capital. He found out I was still close. Still myself, in the parts that mattered most, the parts a curse can put a different shape over but can't actually erase. His hands, resting on his knees, curled slowly into loose fists. And a brother who'd already proven willing to erase me once wasn't going to risk leaving the job half-finished a second time. So he sent men to the lake, Dahlia said quietly, already dreading the rest even as she asked for it. He had us driven onto the ice in the dead of winter, Roan said, all 12 of us together, the pack and myself, the way you'd herd cattle toward a slaughtering pen rather than men he was supposed to consider a threat worth respecting. And when we were far enough out that there was nowhere left to run, he broke the ice beneath us with cannon fire from the shore. His voice had gone very flat, very even, the way a person speaks about something too large to say any other way without it breaking them open completely. I remember the sound more than the cold. I think I'll remember that sound for the rest of whatever life I have left. Dahlia sat with that for a long moment, letting the weight of it settle properly before she spoke again, because some things deserved silence before they deserved words. That's not protecting a throne, she finally said, quiet but certain, the way she might state a fact about whether she'd seen coming for days. That's just cruelty wearing a crown. Roan looked at her then, and something shifted in his face, something that looked almost like surprise at hearing his own private verdict spoken back to him by someone else's mouth, as though he hadn't quite believed it was allowed to be said plainly until she'd said it. Most people who learn what I am want me gone before sundown, he said, and his voice had gone rougher now, less guarded. They hear curse, they hear wolf, and the kindest reaction I usually get is fear dressed up as politeness. You're sitting closer to the fire instead of further from it, and I find I don't quite know what to do with that. I pulled 12 wolves out of a frozen lake yesterday, Dahlia said, and a small, tired smile pulled at the corner of her mouth despite everything they'd just spoken about. I think I gave up on being a sensible woman somewhere around wolf number 4. There wasn't much sense left in me to protect by the time you came up out of that water. For the first time since she dragged him out of the lake, Rome laughed, low and a little rough from disuse, like the sound had to find its way through something that hadn't been used in a long while. It cracked something open in his face, something that looked, for just a moment, less like a soldier carrying an old wound and more like a man who had been allowed, just barely, to set part of that weight down. The first rider. The fire had nearly gone out by the time either of them spoke again, and Dahlia found she didn't mind the cold settling in around her shoulders. It felt honest, somehow, sitting in the same chill that had nearly taken Roan's life, listening to the rest of what that cold had cost him. "Thank you," she said eventually, "for telling me all of it. I know that wasn't easy to hand over to someone you met 2 days ago." "You've already handed me more trust than that," Roan said. "You let 12 strange animals into your barn and only one of them turned out to be a man. Most people would have run the moment I started talking. My father always said I had a weak head for sensible decisions," Dahlia said, "and a strong arm for rope. I suppose between the two of those, you got lucky." They let the conversation rest there for the night, but it didn't take long for the world outside the barn to remind them both that luck rarely stays generous for long. The first of Garrick's men came on the 4th day, and he came dressed like exactly the kind of man no one in Corin would think twice about. He arrived on a sturdy gray horse loaded with the sort of goods a wandering trader carries, bolts of dyed wool, small iron tools, a few jars of preserved fruit. And he smiled easily at the women drawing water near the well, the way a man smiles when he's been trained to be liked quickly. He gave his name as Bennick, said he'd come up from the lowland towns chasing better prices on fur before the spring thaw made the roads soft, and he asked about Corin's hunting the way any trader might. Then, almost as an afterthought, he asked about the lake. Dahlia heard about him before she ever saw him, because Ottilie Marsh came to her door within the hour, her sharp eyes sharper than usual. "There's a man at the well asking about wolves at Lake Meyer," Ottilie said. "Unusually large ones." He asked it twice, to 2 different women, in 2 different ways, like he was checking whether the story would change in the telling. "That's not how a fur trader asks a question," Dahlia said. "No," Ottilie agreed. "That's how a man asks a question when he already knows the answer and wants to see if anyone will lie to him about it." Dahlia found him herself not long after, standing near the smithy with his horse, examining a coil of rope with theatrical interest, as if rope were the reason he'd ridden so far north this time of year. Up close, his clothes were too clean for a man who claimed to have been 3 weeks on muddy roads, and his hands, when he gestured, didn't carry the calluses of someone who loaded and unloaded his own cart. "You'll be the trapper's daughter, then," he said, before she'd said a word to him. "Folks at the well mentioned you. Said you had quite a catch a few days back." "Folks at wells say all sorts of things," Dahlia answered, keeping her voice as plain and unimpressed as she could manage. "Mostly to pass the time until there's real news to talk about. 12 wolves pulled from broken ice sounds like real news to me." His smile didn't waver, but his eyes did, just slightly, watching her face the way a man watches for a tell in a card game. "One of them unusually large," they said. "Big as a man standing on his hind legs, near enough." "Big animals make for big stories," Dahlia said. "By the time a tale's gone through 3 mouths at a well, a fox starts sounding like a bear. I wouldn't put much stock in it if I were passing through. There's nothing out at that lake but cold water and bad luck." Bennick studied her a moment longer than was comfortable, and Dahlia made herself hold still under it the way she'd once held still under the gaze of an injured wolf deciding whether her outstretched hand was a threat. Her father had taught her that flinching first usually decided how the rest of an encounter went. "Of course," Bennick finally said, with a small, easy laugh that didn't reach the rest of his face. "Cold water and bad luck. I'll remember that, in case anyone downriver asks." He left within the hour, his cart rattling south out of the valley, and Dahlia stood at the edge of the village watching him go until he was nothing but a dark speck against the snow. She told Roan everything that night, every word, every detail of his clothes and his hands and the particular way his eyes had stayed too sharp for a man pretending to care only about rope and rumor. Roan listened without interrupting, but Dahlia watched real fear move across his face for the first time since she'd known him, and it wasn't fear for himself. "That wasn't a traitor," he said quietly, once she'd finished. "That was a scout. Garrick wouldn't send a real hunting party on a rumor this thin. He'd send someone clever enough to confirm it first, someone who could ride home with an answer instead of an empty net." "So he doesn't know for certain yet," Dahlia said. "He's certain enough to be afraid of it," Roan answered. "And a man who's afraid of losing his throne doesn't wait long to act on a fear like that. If they think you helped me, if they think this whole village helped me, Garrick won't send a man with a friendly smile and a cart full of wool next time. He'll send enough soldiers that no story this village could tell would matter anymore. He'll burn the proof and call it an accident of weather, and no one outside Corin will ever ask a second question about it." Dahlia felt the cold settle into her chest the way it had settled into her hands the night she'd pulled him from the lake. But underneath the fear, something steadier was already forming, the same stubborn calm her father used to get right before deciding which way the storm was going to break. "Then we don't wait for him to decide it for us," she said. "If you run alone into that snow to spare this village, you'll only be proving to yourself that you deserve what your brother already tried to do to you. I didn't pull you out of that ice to watch you walk back into the cold on your own." The 11 wolves, gathered near the edges of the barn where they'd been listening in the particular still way animals listen when they understand far more of a conversation than people expect them to, made a low sound deep in their throats, not quite a growl, not quite a whimper, but something in between that Dahlia had already started to recognize. It was agreement. It was warning. It was 11 creatures who had already lost everything once telling both of them, in the only language they had left, that they were not prepared to lose it again. The road south. They left before the sun was fully up, while the village was still wrapped in that gray, breath-held quiet that comes just before a winter morning decides what kind of day it intends to be. Dahlia packed light, the way her father had taught her, dried meat, a fire kit, rope she trusted with her life because she'd made it herself, and a blanket that had survived more storms than most of the men in Corin. Roan said little as they loaded what little they had onto the back of her father's old sled, but she noticed he kept glancing toward the tree line, the way a soldier checks a perimeter out of habit rather than necessity. "You don't have to look so grim about it," she said, tying down the last of the supplies. "We're walking toward a capital, not a funeral." "In my experience," Roan said, "those two destinations have a habit of becoming the same place." But there was the faintest ghost of humor in it, and she chose to take that as a good sign. The 11 wolves fell into step around them without needing to be told, spreading into a loose formation that Dahlia realized, after the first hour, was not random at all. 2 ranged ahead as scouts, slipping between the trees and returning with nothing more than a glance to report the road was clear. The rest kept pace beside the sled, close enough to matter, far enough not to spook anyone they might pass. It was, she understood slowly, a discipline that had nothing to do with being animals and everything to do with having survived together long enough to know exactly how to keep each other alive. "They move like soldiers," she said quietly to Roan, watching the 2 scouts disappear and reappear between the pines. "They are soldiers," he said. "Just not the kind anyone ever issued a uniform to." The forest between Corin and the capital was thick enough to swallow an army whole, and Dahlia had grown up reading the particular language of winter weather the way other people read the words on a page. She knew the smell that came an hour before snow turned to ice rain. She knew which color the sky went right before a storm decided to stop pretending it might pass them by. Twice on the road south, she called a halt to make camp earlier than either of them wanted, and twice the sky proved her right within the hour, dropping a storm onto the forest that would have buried less careful travelers without leaving so much as a boot print behind. "How do you always know?" Roan asked her during the second storm. Both of them pressed into the lean shelter she'd built from fallen branches and packed snow, the wolves curled together in a great breathing pile just beyond the opening to keep the wind out. My father used to say the sky talks to people who bother to listen to it, Dahlia said. Most people don't bother. They're too busy looking at the ground in front of their own boots. You don't look at the ground much, Roan observed. Hard habit to keep once you've pulled 12 wolves out of broken ice, she said, and he laughed the low, rough laugh she was starting to listen for without quite admitting to herself that she was listening for it. It was on that road, more than anywhere else, that something shifted quietly between them. Not all at once, not with any single dramatic moment she could point back to later, but the way frost builds slowly across a window until one morning the whole pane is covered and you can't remember exactly when it started. Roan stopped walking a half step ahead of her, the careful protective distance of a soldier guarding precious cargo, and started walking beside her instead, the way a man walks next to someone he has quietly decided is his equal rather than his responsibility. He learned the shape of her silences without needing to ask about them. The short ones, she noticed him realize, meant she was working through a problem and didn't want it interrupted. The longer ones meant she was tired in a way she would never admit to out loud, and he started finding small, unannounced ways to ease those moments, taking the heavier end of the sled rope without comment, building the fire a little higher before she had to ask. She, in turn, learned the parts of him that the soldier's posture worked hard to hide. He flinched, barely, at the sound of cracking branches that sounded too much like ice giving way. He was gentler with the wolves than he ever allowed himself to be with people, scratching behind a scarred ear or pressing his forehead briefly to a tired flank in a way that looked less like a man caring for animals and more like a man checking that the only family he had left were all still breathing. On the fourth night, with the fire burned low and the others finally asleep in a loose circle around the dying coals, Roan reached over without a word and took her cold hand in both of his. He didn't say anything at first. He simply held it, turning it gently, warming her fingers between his palms with the kind of careful attention a person gives to something they've decided matters more than almost anything a king ever ordered them to protect. "You're freezing," he finally said. "I'm always freezing," Dahlia said. "It's a hazard of growing up in a valley that thinks summer is a rumor." "I was ready to die on that ice," he said, and the sudden shift in him, from teasing to bare honesty, made her go still. "Before you ever threw that rope, I mean. I'd stopped fighting the current. I remember thinking, quite clearly, that there wasn't much point in struggling toward a shore that didn't have anything waiting for me on it anymore." "Why?" she asked, though some part of her already suspected the shape of his answer. "Because nothing was waiting for me on the other side of surviving," he said. "My brother had made certain of that. The old king was gone. The men I'd once commanded believed I was already dead, if they thought of me at all. There's only so long a man can keep choosing to fight for a life that doesn't seem to want him back." His thumb moved slowly over her knuckles, an absent, unconscious gesture. "Now something is waiting for me. I don't entirely know how to thank a person for handing you back a reason like that." "You don't have to thank me," Dahlia said, though her voice had gone quieter than she intended. "Just don't waste it." "I don't intend to," he said, and the look he gave her then made the cold forest around them feel smaller than it had any right to feel, like the whole world had narrowed down to the small space between the fire and his eyes. He kissed her carefully at first, the way a man kisses someone he half expects to pull away, giving her every chance to decide otherwise. She didn't take it. Whatever careful restraint he'd started with didn't survive very long once he understood that, and for a while neither of them thought much about kings, curses, or the long road still waiting for them in the morning. It was the kind of kiss shared by two people who had already, somewhere on that road without either of them quite announcing it out loud, decided they would rather face down a king's army standing together than spend the rest of their lives standing safely apart. They didn't speak of it directly the next morning, but something had settled between them that hadn't been there before, a kind of certainty neither one of them needed to put into words. The wolves seemed to sense it too, in whatever way animals sense the changes in the people they've chosen to follow. They fell into step around the two of them a little closer than before, a little more like a single unit than 11 separate creatures and 2 separate humans. By midday, the trees had begun to thin, and far in the distance, rising pale against the gray winter sky, the towers of the capital came into view for the first time. Dahlia felt her stomach tighten at the sight of it, not from fear exactly, but from the sudden, undeniable weight of how much closer they now were to whatever waited for them inside those walls. "That's it," Roan said quietly beside her, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on the towers like a man looking at a door he wasn't certain would open for him. "That's home, or it used to be." "It still can be," Dahlia said. "We didn't walk this whole road just to turn around at the gate." He glanced at her, and whatever doubt had been sitting behind his eyes eased, just slightly, replaced by something steadier. "No," he agreed. "I don't suppose we did." The capital. The hunters found them a half-day's walk from the city walls, and later, Dahlia would think it was almost a mercy that they came in daylight, where she could see exactly what they were dealing with instead of guessing at shapes in the dark. There were 8 of them, riding hard out of a stand of birch trees with the kind of formation that told her immediately these weren't farmers or trappers pressed into service. They rode like men who'd done this before, spears low, faces set. Their leader, a broad man with a scar across his chin and the bearing of someone used to being obeyed, pulled his horse up short the moment he got a clear look at Roan standing in the open. "Captain," he said, and there was no mistaking the surprise in his voice, the kind that comes from a man realizing a rumor he'd half dismissed had just turned out to be true. "We were told to look for a wolf." "You found one," Roan said. "Several, actually." Dahlia didn't wait to see how the conversation would have gone if it had stayed a conversation. She'd already knocked an arrow the moment the riders broke from the tree line, and she loosed it the instant the captain's spear arms started to rise, putting the shaft through his shoulder before he could finish whatever order he'd been about to give. He went down off his horse with a shout, and after that, there wasn't much room left for talking. She had expected chaos. What she got instead was something closer to a dance she didn't know the steps to but could still recognize the shape of. 11 wolves do not fight like 11 separate animals panicking in 11 separate directions. They fight like one decision, made 11 times, in 11 places at once. 2 of them broke left to pull a rider off his horse before he could close on Roan's blind side. 3 more drove straight at the center of the group, scattering the horses, which turned out to be more useful than any blade. A horse that bolts in fear takes its rider with it whether the rider wants to go or not. Roan moved through the middle of it with the kind of discipline that told Dahlia, more clearly than any story he could have told her by the fire, that he really had once trained half the men who now wore his brother's colors. He didn't fight like a man driven by rage. He fought like a man trying to end something as quickly as possible so that fewer people had to get hurt doing it, disarming more than he struck, knocking men from their saddles instead of putting them in the snow for good. Dahlia put a second arrow through the leg of a rider bearing down on one of the smaller wolves, and reloaded fast enough that her hands were shaking afterward more from the speed of it than the fear. By the time it was over. And it was over quickly, faster than she would have believed possible watching it begin, 4 of the riders had broken and fled back toward the trees, and the rest sat in the snow with their hands raised, surrendering to a girl with a bow and a pack of wolves, which was not a sentence any of them would likely repeat without flinching for the rest of their lives. Roan crouched by the wounded captain, checking the wound with a careful, professional hand that looked strange paired with everything else he was. "You'll live," he said. "Tell my brother his men found exactly what he sent them to find. Tell him I'm coming to the gate, and I'd advise him not to bother sending more riders to stop me, because it clearly isn't working." The captain stared up at him, pale with blood loss and disbelief in equal measure. "You're really him," he said. "We thought. Everyone thought." "I know what everyone thought," Roan said, standing. That was rather the point. They reached the capital gates by dusk, the towers Dahlia had seen from the forest now rising close enough to blot out half the sky, lit gold and orange by the dying sun. She had expected Roan to slow down at the threshold, to hesitate the way she would have hesitated walking back into a life that had once tried to drown her. He didn't. He walked through the front gate in the torn remains of a captain's coat, blood from the skirmish still dried along one sleeve, with 11 wolves at his back and a trapper's daughter at his side, and the guards on either side of the archway went rigid the moment they got a proper look at his face. "Captain Calloway," one of them said, the words coming out half question, half disbelief, as if saying it out loud might make it less true. "Lower your spears," Roan said, not unkindly, but with the flat certainty of a man who still expected to be obeyed in this place, curse or no curse. "I haven't come to fight my way through my own gate. I've come to speak with whatever lords are left who remember who my father was." Word moved through the capital faster than anyone could have organized it, the way truth sometimes does when it's been buried under a lie heavy enough that people were quietly relieved to see it dug back up. By the time they reached the inner courtyard, a small crowd had gathered at a careful distance, watching the wolves with wide eyes and watching Roan with something closer to disbelief than fear. Dahlia stayed close to his side, very aware of how strange the two of them must look together, a soldier risen from the dead and a trapper's daughter in a fur coat still faintly stained with lake water, walking into a palace like they had every right to be there. She decided, somewhere around the second courtyard, that she was going to act like she belonged there even if her stomach didn't agree with the decision. "Are you frightened?" Roan asked quietly, glancing sideways at her as they climbed the final stairs toward the throne room doors. "Terrified," she admitted. "But I decided a few days ago that terrified doesn't have to mean turning around." He almost smiled at that, despite everything waiting on the other side of the doors ahead of them. The throne room doors opened before either of them had to ask, pushed wide by guards who looked far less certain of their orders than they wanted to appear, and Roan walked through them without breaking his stride. Garrick was already on his feet by the time they crossed the threshold, rising from the throne so fast his cup of wine tipped and spilled red across the marble step beneath it, no one moving to clean it, every eye in the room fixed instead on the brother who was supposed to be lying at the bottom of a frozen lake. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Dahlia could hear her own heartbeat, could hear the low, steady breathing of the wolves spread out behind them at the threshold, patient and watchful, the way a held breath waits to be let out. "You were supposed to be dead," Garrick finally said, and his voice cracked slightly in the middle of the sentence, the first crack Dahlia had seen in a man who had clearly spent 2 years building himself into someone unshakable. "I was," Roan said. A trapper's daughter disagreed. The reckoning. The silence that followed Roan's words stretched long enough that Dahlia could hear the wine still dripping off the edge of the dais, a slow, steady sound in a room that had otherwise gone completely still. Garrick hadn't moved from where he stood in front of the throne, one hand braced against its arm as though he needed it to stay upright, his pale eyes fixed on his brother like a man staring at a ghost that had decided to be inconvenient about staying dead. It was one of the older lords who broke the silence first, a thin gray-haired man Dahlia would later learn was named Edmund Havers, who had served under Roan and Garrick's father for 30 years and had the kind of face that had clearly seen enough court intrigue not to be easily fooled twice. "Captain Calloway," Havers said slowly, stepping forward from the gathered crowd of lords and guards along the walls. "Forgive me. I want to be certain my eyes aren't deceiving an old man. You vanished on patrol near the northern border. We were told wolves took you." "Wolves did take me," Roan said. "Just not in the way anyone was meant to believe." He told it plainly, the same way he told it to Dahlia by the fire days before, except this time his voice carried the flat, careful precision of a soldier giving a report rather than a man confessing a wound. "The witch on the eastern road. The cursed skin paid for in gold. The 11 wolves who had taken him in when he had nowhere else to go. The cannon fire on the ice, ordered not by any enemy of the kingdom, but by the king's own brother, standing not 10 paces away in robes that had clearly been chosen to make a usurped throne look earned rather than stolen." Garrick said nothing through most of it. Dahlia watched him instead of watching Roan, and what she saw on his face wasn't outrage at being falsely accused. It was the particular stillness of a man calculating how much of the truth had already escaped his control and how much he might still be able to bury. "This is absurd," Garrick finally said, when Roan had finished. "A fairy story. My brother died at the border 2 winters ago, and grief has clearly driven someone to dress a stranger up in his memory. I won't have the court's time wasted on. Tell them about the witch, Garrick, Roan said, quiet and even, cutting through his brother's words without raising his voice at all. Tell them her name. I'll wait. Garrick's jaw tightened, and for the first time, something in his composure visibly slipped. I don't know what you're. Her name was Iselda, Roan said, turning to address the room rather than his brother now. She kept a cottage 3 days east of here, near the river crossing at Thistlemoor. My brother visited her twice before I disappeared, and once more after, to ask whether the curse could be made permanent. I know this because the man who arranged the meetings on his behalf is standing in this very room, 3rd row from the left, and judging by how pale he's gone, I suspect he remembers it rather better than my brother is hoping he does. Every head in the throne room turned, and the man in question. A minor steward named Corin, who had clearly spent 2 years assuming this particular secret would never resurface, went the color of old ash. Speak the truth, Corin, Havers said, his voice carrying the authority of 30 years' service. Whatever loyalty you believe you owe the crown a greater one, and lying to this room is treason regardless of which brother you're lying to protect. Corin's hands were visibly shaking by the time he spoke, but he spoke, and what he said matched Roan's account in every detail that mattered, the witch, the gold, the order given afterward to drive the cursed wolves onto the ice once Garrick learned his brother hadn't simply vanished into the forest the way he'd been promised, but had remained close enough, and human enough, to still be a threat. By the time Corin finished, the room didn't need any further convincing. Cruelty dressed up as strength has a way of revealing itself the moment someone finally holds it up to the light, and Dahlia watched 2 years of carefully built authority come apart in the space of a few short, plain sentences. You wanted my command without ever wanting the cost that came with it, Roan said to his brother, once the room had gone quiet again. Men followed me because I made certain they came home from the battles I led. You wanted the following without doing the work the following was built on. So instead of becoming a better commander, you decided it would be easier to remove the comparison entirely. I did what I had to do to survive being your shadow, Garrick said, and there was real bitterness in it now, the carefully composed mask finally cracking all the way through. Do you have any idea what it is to spend your whole life being told you're the lesser version of someone, by your own father, in front of every man who matters? I have some idea, yes, Roan said quietly. I spent 2 years freezing under a curse you arranged because you couldn't survive being compared to me. I think I understand the feeling rather more intimately than you'd like to imagine. Garrick had no answer for that, and the silence that followed was its own kind of verdict. The lords didn't need an army to settle what came next. Truth, spoken plainly enough and backed by enough frightened witnesses suddenly willing to unburden themselves, did more damage to Garrick's claim to the throne than any battle could have managed. Within the hour, guards who had spent 2 years following his orders without question were standing on the other side of the room, no longer at his back. What happens to him? Dahlia asked quietly, as the lords began debating the particulars in low, urgent voices nearby. That's the question, isn't it? Roan said, watching his brother being quietly surrounded by men who, until an hour ago, had called him king. Some in this room will want him executed, Havers said, overhearing. It would be the clean solution. No rival claim left standing, no risk of him gathering loyalists later and trying again. Roan was quiet for a long moment, his eyes on his brother, who would not meet his gaze. Exile him instead, he finally said. Strip him of title, send him beyond the northern border with enough provisions to survive the winter and not one coin more. Let him learn what it is to be entirely alone in the cold, the way he made certain I learned it. But I won't give an order that ends with my brother's body in the ground, whatever he's done. I spent 2 years under that ice deciding what kind of man I wanted to be if I ever climbed back out of it. I'm not interested in being the kind of king cruelty makes. Mercy, after everything he did to you, Dahlia said softly, not quite a question. Mercy isn't weakness, Roan said, loud enough now for the room to hear it, his eyes still on his brother. My brother thought it was. That's precisely why he lost everything, and I'm still standing here to say so. Garrick was led from the throne room without another word, and whatever satisfaction Dahlia expected to feel watching it happen didn't quite arrive. What she felt instead was something steadier, something that settled into her chest the way warmth settles back into cold hands held too long by a fire, the quiet certainty that the man standing beside her had walked through the worst betrayal of his life and come out the other side choosing, deliberately, not to become the thing that had hurt him. The 11 wolves, who had waited patiently at the threshold through the entire exchange, rose together as the throne room doors opened again, and fell into step behind Roan as he turned away from the throne that, by every right of blood, was now his to take. What the ice gave back, expanded. Garrick was gone from the capital within 3 days, escorted north under guard with provisions that would keep a careful man alive through winter and nothing more, and a silence followed his departure that felt less like grief and more like a held breath finally being let out. Dahlia watched the gates close behind the small, grim procession and found she didn't feel triumphant. She felt tired, the particular kind of tired that comes after carrying something heavy for a long time and finally being allowed to set it down. "You're quiet," Roan said, coming to stand beside her on the wall above the gate, the wind pulling at both their coats. "I keep thinking about your face when you told them to spare him," she said. "I've never seen a man choose to be kinder than the world had any right to expect of him." "I thought about it the whole walk south," Roan admitted. "There were nights on that road I imagined a dozen different endings for him, and in most of them I wasn't nearly so generous. But I kept coming back to the same thought. If I let what he did to me decide what kind of man I become, then the lake finished the job after all. It just took 2 more years than he planned for." Dahlia slipped her hand into his, and he held it the same careful, deliberate way he had that night by the campfire, like something worth protecting rather than something owed to him. The lords offered Roan the crown formally within the week, and there was little debate about it once the truth had settled properly through the court. He accepted it the way Dahlia suspected he accepted most heavy things. Without ceremony, without performance, simply because the work needed doing and he was the one left standing close enough to do it. His first decree surprised no one who had walked the road south with him. The old hunting grounds along the eastern border, the same forests that had once seen wolves driven onto cracking ice for the crime of being inconvenient to a frightened man's ambitions, were placed under royal protection. No trapper, no hunter, no soldier following careless orders would be permitted to set snare or spear there again without answering directly to the crown for it. They were never cursed men hiding in fur, Roan told the assembled court, his hand resting on the head of the largest of the 11, a graying wolf named, in the rough, affectionate way the pack had given each other names over their years together, Bramble. They were simply wolves who had lost everything to the same kind of men who once hunted me through that same forest. They didn't ask to become part of this story. They chose to stay in it anyway, the way Real family chooses to stay, curse or no curse. The decree was met with little resistance. It is difficult, after all, to argue against mercy in a court that has just watched cruelty unmake itself so thoroughly. Spring came to Corin the way it always had, slow and stubborn, ice retreating from the edges of the lake a little further each morning until one day the water lay open and calm beneath a sky that finally remembered how to be blue. Dahlia stood at its edge in early thaw light, the same patch of shoreline where she'd once knelt with a rope burning across her palms, and found that the place no longer felt like the site of a near tragedy. It felt, instead, like the place where everything that mattered most to her had actually begun. Roan came to stand beside her, no longer dressed as the soldier who had once knelt shivering in the snow, nor as the king who now held court 3 days' ride south, but simply as a man who had asked to be married at the edge of the same water that had nearly taken his life, because he wanted the lake to remember something kinder than what it had almost become known for. "They wanted you to drown," Dahlia said, watching the water that had once screamed beneath the ice. "Instead I got a second life," Roan said, "and somehow it turned out to be a far better one than the first. I don't think I ever properly thanked the woman responsible for that." "You've thanked me plenty," she said. "Mostly without words." He laughed, the easy, unguarded laugh she'd come to know well over the months between that frozen morning and this one, and pulled her close enough that the cold coming off the lake didn't matter at all. They were married that summer in front of the whole village of Corin, with Audley Marsh standing as witness and looking, for once, less sharp-eyed than satisfied, and with 11 wolves resting at the edges of the ceremony like guests who understood perfectly well they had been invited and had every right to be there. Bramble lay closest to the front, head resting on his paws, watching the two of them the entire time with the steady, patient attention of a creature who had waited a long time to see this particular ending arrive. There is a lesson in this story worth carrying past the final page. Cruelty dressed up as strength always cracks eventually, the same way ice cracks under weight it was never built to hold. And kindness. The kind that reaches into cold water without knowing what it will pull out, is rarely as foolish as it looks in the moment it's offered. Sometimes the person willing to grab the rope is the only reason anyone gets a second chance at all. Subscribe to see how this unfolds, and comment where you're watching from. I would love to say hello to you, just to know how far our story is going.